Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of RTHD. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of RTHD QuickTech, and in this episode I'd like to discuss the differences between CPUs, GPUs and APUs. Before we begin, if you would just take that opportunity to click subscribe and of course to like this video, I would so much appreciate it. Please of course make sure to hit that bell icon as well to be notified of new videos just like this, of quick videos that we answer questions about tech. With that being said, let's get quick into this how-to tutorial. Okay, so first thing we need to understand is what is a CPU. A CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. All processors have CPU capabilities, thus all processors at the core are CPUs. CPUs do most of the processing in a computer, such as calculations and so forth. It's a little more obviously more complicated than that, but we have to consider that CPUs do the calculations and so forth. And so a computer cannot work without a CPU, theoretically speaking. A lot of the times people describe the CPU as the brain of the computer, in the sense that without, of course, your brain, you can't really do anything much, just like a human without a brain. And so that's kind of where a CPU comes in. CPU does all the thinking pretty much, has a lot of logic and so forth. So that's simply what a CPU is. And so let's get over to what is a dedicated GPU. A GPU stands for Graphics Processing Unit. In the past, GPUs were dedicated and usually found in dedicated graphics cards. And GPUs are used to render graphics onto the screen. While many use GPUs for games, a computer must have some type of GPU rendering device to output to the screen. So the fact that you are actually looking at a screen right now means that your computer has to have some type of GPU. The question is, of course, whether it is a dedicated GPU or whether it is a shared GPU. But in essence, by all intents and purposes, all computers must have a graphics processing unit in order to be able to see things on the screen. So the next thing is, what is an APU, which is something sort of more newer age in technology. APU stands for Accelerated Processing Unit. All processors have CPU capabilities, but not all are APUs. So an APU is a processor, and therefore it can do CPU processing, but an APU is more than just a CPU. An APU can be considered to be a higher level CPU. It contains both the ability to process normal data but also graphics data. So consider an APU sort of like a CPU and a GPU. So an APU thus has graphics capabilities, usually in the form of additional cores dedicated to graphics processing within that physical processor. And therefore, an APU is usually a CPU and a GPU combined into one processor. So what's the differences? And I sort of tried to show some advantages and disadvantages, but all in one, right? So we're comparing CPU, APU, and dedicated GPU, remembering that CPU and APUs both can do processing, so they are CPUs. A GPU is not considered to be a CPU. So I just added that in to sort of show you guys the differences on what the needs are for each one. So if we were to compare all three, we'll see that a CPU has processing capabilities, and so does the APU. You can see that here, processing capabilities. And a GPU does not have processing capabilities. What I mean by that, and I have to be very accurate, is that a GPU can do processing, but it focuses on graphics processing and not so much other processing that a normal CPU and APU does. And so that's what I mean by no processing capabilities. Now, a CPU has no graphics capabilities, while an APU has medium level quality graphics capabilities. A dedicated GPU, usually if it is newer or around the same time that it was built as an APU, a dedicated GPU will usually have the highest level of graphics capabilities. It will be a little bit better when it comes to gaming and so forth. So that's why I added that in there. And also, a CPU requires a dedicated graphics card. So a computer that has a simple CPU will not be able to just generally display something to the screen. It needs a dedicated graphics card in order to display to the screen. While an APU sort of does both of that. An APU does not require you to have an additional graphics card in that computer. The actual APU caters and does the work of generating the graphics with an additional part of the motherboard that is dedicated to generating graphics as well. And so that's why for dedicated GPU I had depends, because the GPU cannot really do anything without the CPU. So it depends on how you look at things. Alright, so let's move on to the other point. So a CPU does not reduce available memory on computer. A CPU is quite restricted and focuses pretty much on processing, and yes, it does use memory, but not in the way that an APU uses memory. So we'll get to that, because remember we are talking about APU in regards to graphics. So a CPU will not dedicate any memory towards its graphics capabilities. However, an APU that has graphics, a GPU sort of built into it, requires available memory on the computer, and it usually uses what is currently on the computer, which is your random access memory, your RAM. So you tend to have a little less RAM, actually a lot less RAM, depending on how much RAM you dedicate towards the APU, the GPU part of the APU. So for example, if you were to have 8 gigs of RAM and you have an APU with a graphics processing unit within the APU, you probably would dedicate about 1 gig of that 8 gigs of RAM towards the graphics processing, and so you'd effectively have only about 7 gigabytes of memory available to do processing work other than the graphics processing, if that makes any sense. With a dedicated CPU, a dedicated GPU card will not use up the random access memory, because it usually comes with its own memory, and so that's a good thing about having a dedicated GPU. With that being said, let's move on to the last point, which is that for a CPU, more components for computer to be operational is required. So basically, in order to have a computer that works, you'll have to make sure that the CPU also is combined with a dedicated video card, or else the computer will not be able to boot up and you won't be able to see anything on the screen. With an APU, you don't need a dedicated video card, and so it has less components for the computer to be operational. So instead of having instead of the CPU, which requires the RAM, the motherboard, the CPU, and the dedicated graphics, which is four pieces to display something onto the screen, an APU only requires the APU, the motherboard, and the RAM in order to be able to display something on the screen. And of course, well, a dedicated GPU can't do anything without either a CPU or an APU. So that's pretty much the differences. So at the end of it all, a CPU does only processing, thinking, logic, and requires a dedicated graphics card in order to display to the screen, while an APU is able to do that without requiring a dedicated graphics card, and that's why it's usually hybrid and a little more latest in technology. So with that being said, I want to thank you. We hope that this answered some of your questions. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon, and let me know if you have any more questions. Just comment below and I'll be able to try to answer that as soon as possible. Thanks again, and see you guys. Bye.